Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gamer Titacom video, let's discuss frame rate and resolution, shall we? We're going to discuss why it keeps popping up in the news, why developers consistently lying, and that's what they are doing, lying to us regarding the reasons that they are choosing the resolutions and frame rates they are, is bad for not only the industry, but eventually for them themselves, as well, of course, as consumer confidence and consumers as a whole, and how they could really just fix this issue. It wouldn't be too difficult. At the end of the day, I think people would be, well, quite happy with the answer if they were just honest. So, before we go into that, resolution and frame rate, basically frame rate is how many times a second the image is updated. Higher frame rates, generally speaking, make for much better playing experiences because, quite honestly speaking, it means that you get a more fluid handling of the controls, and quite simply put, more frames equals better aiming and so on. In first-person shooters, it means that action is more fluid and it just plays better. In terms of native resolution, quite simply put, the amount of pixels that the GPU is rendering. Now, the reason they go for lower numbers is to put the graphics processing unit or the CPU or the system as a whole under less pressure. Very simple stuff. Now, developers range in their stretching of the truth. For example, From Software, who are responsible for Bloodborne on the PlayStation 4, have recently come out and said it's best for action games, although apparently there was a slight mistranslation, and since then they added, with a caveat, for action games like Bloodborne. So in other words, they're saying for titles like their title. Then you've got more factually incorrect still from developers like, say, I don't know, Ubisoft. And they, of course, are coming out with cinematic experiences 30 FPS. And various other developers say, well, the reason we've gone with basically massive, huge borders, for example, the Evil Within, the Order 1886, is for a more cinematic experience, a more movie-like experience, or in other cases for aesthetic reasons, whatever the reason. It's basically still PR gubbins just to say that they are natively rendering a 1080p, or try to palm it off as 1080p, when in reality, much of the screen is just basically black. So from a developer's perspective, the reason they're saying this is a couple of reasons, actually. The first, and fairly obvious one, is they're trying to sell their game. If they come across and say, well, it's because we are constrained by the hardware, people are going to complain. You're going to get, I don't like to use the term, but effectively that's what we have to label them as, like, extreme fanboys saying, no, you're just being idiots, you can't optimize for the hardware, your fault, blah blah blah. If they say it's for cinematic reasons, they feel that they're going to cut back on some of the backlash. And this, of course, is the infamous, we're trying to cut back on the debates and stuff from Ubisoft, when in reality saying that isn't going to make a difference. It's just going to piss everyone off. In fact, PlayStation 4 owners, of course, are even more angry, and then you've got the whole was it downgraded situation deliberately, and it wasn't a good statement. It's a very bad idea for Ubisoft to have said that. Additionally, console manufacturers, primarily Sony, but also Microsoft, of course, and to a lesser extent, to a slightly lesser extent, Nintendo, they don't want it being publicly admitted that their hardware, the new released hardware, is just not capable. It's incapable of running at these resolutions what we demand, or the frame rates that we demand. And once again, it goes back to the fact that it's just better to say, nope, it's for design decisions. Now, design decisions are a lot harder to pass off when it comes to resolution, and I'll tell you why. Because now, most people know, even if you're not super into tech, the 1080p screens are standard. They're just normal now. Like 720p 4 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe people still had 720p, but most people now, the 720p sets are broken, or 1080p has just become so cheap. 1080p is now the normal. But worse than that, 4K is starting to come out, and PCs, of course, you've got bastardized resolutions, pretty much different resolutions, but 1440p is certainly pretty standard as well. But let's assume primarily focus on 4K and 1080p, and I'll tell you why, because the issues mostly at the moment are revolving around consoles, and I don't want to bring PCs too much into this because it's just unfair against the consoles. For the most part, although we do have to dabble in the PC side of things to a degree, but we'll get to that. It's easier, therefore, to lower the resolution, to not lower the resolution, but to lower the frame rate. Because with frame rate, you can get away with saying cinematic experience, and those that don't know any better, they don't really think of these things, maybe. But resolution, it's a very marketable thing to say 1080p, and that's one of the reasons that the whole resolution gate issues happened with Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. And that's another reason that Ubisoft have been definitely accused, and there is some evidence, although it depends, I suppose, on how you wish to interpret it. The parity has definitely been heavily... How can I put this in a kind way? It's been heavily implied that the developers would like parity from the perspective of Microsoft. Because obviously you've got the Assassin's Creed deal with the Xbox One and so on. It doesn't look good to have the deal with the Xbox One, but the Xbox One version is running at 900p, the PS4 version is running at 1080p, or whatever. It could run at 960p, or whatever it ends up running at. So... You've got this really weird situation right now where developers don't feel that they can be totally honest. Now that's just marketing, you're going to say. Well, yes it is. But, I mean, I've been gaming for a long time. And definitely lies and propaganda. I mean, do you remember the whole PlayStation Toy Story comments back in the day? And Sony, I will be totally honest, I do feel that Sony, out of all the companies, I would say that Nintendo were overly honest in terms of the graphics. In actuality, if I had to be totally blunt, I would say Nintendo undersell their graphics, particularly with the GameCube. They criminally undersold the performance of the GameCube. There's a couple of comments from developers that said they actually got better performance out of the GameCube than what Nintendo actually said. In other words, unofficially the system could actually push more pixels than what Nintendo would say. The N64 was a bit of an issue. There were some memory issues there, primarily bandwidth, but with the GameCube onwards, Nintendo have been a bit coy. They haven't really said much about the Wii U situation. They're remaining very quiet on that because at the end of the day, they know they can't compete on the Xbox One or the PS4. Microsoft, for the most part, are fairly honest. I have to say that initially they had some problems with the Xbox One, but I think recently they have been quite honest about the system's performance, and they've not let any of the silly rumours about hidden GPUs and any of that bollocks actually stand. They've been fairly blunt. But enough about the developers, enough about Sony and Microsoft for a second. Let's discuss us as gamers, us as critics, and us as the players at the end of the day. We are the ones that are putting money into these companies' pockets, right? Now, the reason effectively that you have bought an Xbox One, the reason you have bought a PlayStation 4, the reason you have bought an upgraded gaming PC, the reason you're buying these pieces of hardware is for the games to look and play better. Simple as, like, for example, there's a reason that you buy, let's say you've got an Xbox 360 still and you've got an Xbox One, just pure example. And let's assume that you wanted to buy Watch Dogs back in the day. Did you buy it on the Xbox One assuming you had it, or did you buy it on the 360? Of course you bought it on the new platform. You had the choice, even though it cost you a little bit more on the Xbox One because Xbox One games are slightly more expensive than the 360. But I can almost guarantee it, you probably bought it on the Xbox One, assuming you had the system at the time. Why? So you can have the better gaming experience. You've got the better graphics, you've got the next generation effects, you've got the higher resolution, you theorise you're going to get better frame rates. And that's what it's been like since the dawn of time. I'm going to pull the PC into this, not as a comparison with the consoles, but just to give you an idea. Back in the day when GPUs were really moving fast, this was in the late 90s and early 2000s, they basically graphics processing units on the PC. Well, back then there were video cards, they weren't really GPUs, but back then they move really quickly, and then they're slowed down, then they move quickly again, then they're slowed down, and it kind of happens like that for a couple of generations. Some things will slow down, things will speed up. But back then, the Voodoo 2 came out, everyone bought it because it was a significant upgrade from the original Voodoo. Then the TNTs came out and the Voodoo 3s. You would make your decision whether 32-bit rendering, color rendering was better for you, or if you wanted faster frame rates, generally you would go with the Voodoo 3. You would make a decision. A lot of people were split, but a lot of people bought the Voodoo 3 because they wanted the faster frame rates, and it was 24-bit internal color anyway, and then it basically got translated down to 16-bit, so it's fairly accurate. But anyway, 3D effects lost a lot of sales because their GPUs just couldn't render internally at 32-bit. That's pretty obvious, and the fact that they had less memory also was a bit of a problem. Then the GeForces came. The TNT2 came out. I know a couple of people who bought the TNT2 directly after the TNT1. As soon as the TNT2 successor came out, the original GeForce, which was SDR, single data RAM, people bought that. Then people, of course, sold their SDRs to get the DDRs because the DDR had significantly more memory bandwidth, and so overclocking your SDR just didn't provide the GPU enough memory bandwidth, so people bought, well, you guessed it, the GeForce 1 and then the GeForce 2, and this was because at the time a lot of titles were very Twitch based and competitive. For example, you had the Quake 3 that was doing the rounds, you had the Unreal tournaments, Counter-Strike as well. I believe Counter-Strike was out around then, but anyway, you get the general gist. So you had all these titles which were popping up and people wanted those frame rates. Sometimes they would even lower their internal resolution just to get the extra frame rates. For example, they might play Quake 3 at like 800 by 600, especially if they couldn't afford the latest and greatest graphics card to get those frames up. And they would do tweaking of their internet configurations and so on and so on and so on. All of this to get the best playable gaming experience. It's the same with consoles as well. I went from a Master System. I'm actually missing some consoles out deliberately because I'll be here all day. But I went from Master System to Mega Drive, and then from Mega Drive I got the CD add-on, and then I got the Sega Saturn, and I got a PlayStation, I got a Dreamcast, and I got a PlayStation 2, and I got the original Xbox, and I got Xbox 360 and the GameCube, and so on and so on. And the reason I bought these things was because of the better graphics and the better frame rates, and therefore we had this expectation that it's keeping up for the most part with technology. But I think many of us just don't feel like that this generation. The PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One have come out, and they've come out in a really weird time. The previous generation consoles were very long in the tooth. Developers like, for example, Naughty Dog got a lot out of the previous generation. They did. There's no one that can tell me that, say, The Last of Us wasn't graphically impressive. It was. It had frame rate issues up the wazoo, it had some clipping problems and some bugs, but overall it was a very impressive experience on the PlayStation 3. And, of course, Xbox 360 had some very impressive games as well. Like if you were to look at the last Halos that came out, or its final titles versus, say, the original Perfect Dark Zero, which I got on launch of the 360. You know, it looked fairly impressive. It was definitely a step up from the original Xbox, but since then titles have improved. Now, there were some rush jobs on the original PS3 launch games, as well as the Xbox 360. A couple of games didn't hit native 720p, which was what they were aiming at with that generation, and the reason behind that was poor optimization or poor development kits, or just because they didn't have enough time in development, and whatever the reason. But for the most part, for quite some time, the games were looking better and better and better and better and better. We had better levels of anti-aliasing, and towards the end of the console's lives, if you Google around for native resolutions of a lot of those titles, it's on Beyond 3D, there's a thread, and you can see that quite a few of them don't have native 1080p. So, for example, you'll have like 1024 by 720. In other words, like their horizontal resolution or their vertical resolution, or they've got post-processing rather than, say, MSA-A, or whatever they need to do to get the frame rate or the resolution looking better. So now, we as gamers expected the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One to do that. Unfortunately, they're just not able to render natively at 1080p. That's just the science behind it. The graphics cards, the CPUs, even the memory, the bandwidth on those consoles like the PS4, You know, so much was made of the 176 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, and this is another point that I want to get to in just a second. But the PS4's memory bandwidth, to be honest, is what it should have been given the performance of the GPU, especially considering that it's not based on the Tonga architecture of the latest like GCN revisions of from AMD, which had memory bandwidth improvements. So they're more efficient, basically. It compresses some of the data in the GPU. This doesn't have that as far as what we understand. In other words, the issue is that it needs every scrap of that memory bandwidth. So you still can't be wasteful with the memory bandwidth you've got. We know that. Developers have stated that. It's pretty much on record now. You've even got the guys like Naughty Dog that have stated this. It's just as it is. So in other words, 176 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth isn't like the GPU only needs 150 and they've given you, that Sony gave you extra. No, this is what's required, especially when you start to consider the fact that the GPU isn't the only thing that's using that memory bandwidth. You've got the audio processors, you've got the CPU, you've got the OS as a whole that's using it for other situations. You've got a lot of stuff that's basically using this memory bandwidth, right? So it's roughly what you expect, because you've got multiple buses on the PS4, so all of them are accessing the GPU, well, not all of them access the GPU, memory, but you know what I mean. So you've got a very weird situation right now, and I've alluded to this before, that we expect 1080p as a standard in this generation. Everyone expected it. We expected it for a couple of reasons. One, it makes sense. The previous generation primarily focused on 720p, so 1080p makes sense. So what happened is we've had three issues. One, it was a natural expectation, especially since 4K. It just makes sense. You can't tell someone that the game's going to run at 720 or maybe 900p. Are you kidding me? That's what the previous generation. Now, you can argue about the quality of the pixels, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the fact of the matter is, we still expect 60 FPS because it's a natural evolution. And it's not like 60 FPS is new. A lot of games on the PS2 were 60 FPS. A lot of games on the PS1 were 60 FPS. Even the Genesis, the SNES, even the bloody NES was running at 60 FPS for the most part, especially if you were in the United States. With the UK and Europe, it wasn't, because you had the 50 Hz issue, which was one of the problems with a lot of Capcom fighting games when they were released over, and Tekken 3 as well on the PlayStation 1. There was a reason that the PS1 version, like for example myself, I was really into Tekken. I entered competitions and stuff and played the arcade. But one of the problems for me was that for quite a long time I was used to the PAL version of the bloody title. So eventually I just had to say, forget this crap. I had to import the American version, I believe it was. It was either Japanese or American, but I think it was American. And I had to play on the US version, because my timings were like 17.5% slower, 50 Hz versus 60 Hz. It just screwed me up. Alright, so you could tell that, especially in a fighting game. But this also happened for other games as well. The benefit, of course, with PAL is technically we did get a few more lines in the image, so technically the image quality was slightly better. But you know what? Forget that. I want the bloody frame rate. And this is another thing as well with the Saturn that was a very popular mod, 60 Hz switch, and quite a few consoles now, especially retro, you've got that 60 Hz option. So in other words, what I'm saying is the whole 30 frames per second isn't new. As gamers, we've been expecting 60 FPS for some time. PCs, 60 FPS, are you serious? Like 120 Hz, it's 144 Hz. And there's a reason that gamers are going for that. I don't think everyone, however, can tell, and this might be a bit controversial, I don't think the average gamer can most likely notice 80 to 120 Hz. I'm not saying everyone, you possibly can, especially if you're more interested in competitive scene, but the average gamer probably can't, but they can definitely tell the difference between 30 and 60. For me, personally, I used to be able to tell the difference a lot more when I was like very into the competitive. I wouldn't say I was super competitive into Quake 3, but I used to play it quite a bit, and I used to play Counter-Strike quite a bit, and I could tell the difference between 60 and like 80, especially on a CRT monitor. Now I'm less sensitive to it, but I can still bloody well tell the difference between 30 and 60 Hz, and many people still can. So, one issue, our expectations. Second issue, we expect, and this kind of goes into our expectations, but it also goes into what companies have promised us. We expect this stuff because we've had tech demos, we've had constant bombardment of this is what you're going to get into the next generation. I believe Sony are probably slightly more guilty of this in terms of, if I had to put a finger on between Sony and Microsoft, Sony is slightly more guilty of this than Microsoft, but Microsoft are just equally as bad. I would say slightly less guilty maybe in pushing the specs of the machine, but when you start hearing Sony consistently say the most powerful game console out there, it's got 176 gigabytes RAM, 176 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, 176 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, GDDR5 memory, and then you've got like 1.84 teraflops of computer, and this message constantly just bombarding people, right? And it's for the players, and then you see these like incredible screenshots in 1080p and all of this stuff. That's what people are gonna expect. It's that simple. Worse, compounding this massively, you have these bullshots with, like, from Ubisoft, the whole visual downgrade thing from Watch Dogs. I'm not even gonna touch that because I've discussed it so many times. But it was just obvious there were massive visual downgrades. It's obvious. You don't need to be into graphics to see the fact that there is visual downgrades. You can tell just by looking at the bloody thing that the lighting looks flatter for a start. Then you've got other things like, massive borders on games. People, they know this stuff, and you can say what you want, but this stuff is always going to be constant. People are going to think about this because they have this expectation because you've built it in their bloody head. Furthermore, another issue is you have indie developers that are capitalizing on this. You've got smaller indie guys, which, for example, the guys behind In Space We Battle, and I did tackle this point in that particular video, but the problem with the quotes they had of, like, saying the PlayStation 4 is too powerful, now you can argue that they were not misquoted, but they didn't mean it in a negative way. However, some cynical people could also take that as to say, if not them, other indie developers have certainly capitalized into this, and they can use those sound bites, those little sound bites, to push their game, because they know, because they're a developer, they are going to get tripped. And this is happening a lot with middleware developers, by the way. They might not even be technically inclined because they might be sound developers, or they might be developing just a very small aspect of a much larger cog, and so that their quotes are going to be used, and they know this, and they know it's going to help to promote their company. And it's a problem, because, you guessed it, it adds more fuel to the fire. If you really want me to tell you how to fix the issue, because the problem is, this isn't going to be going away. Companies want it to go away, but it's not going to go away. Because here's what's going to happen. Those of us who know about frame rate and the resolution, we're not going to fall for this stuff. It's just not going to happen. You can't tell someone that knows about how frame rate works or how resolution works that a lower number is better. It just doesn't make any physical sense. For those who don't know about it so much, and 4K in just a couple of years' time is going to become the standard. And by that point, games are not going to be able to be 1080p natively, because we as consumers are going to consistently want better looking games. So in other words, consumer confidence is at some point going to be shot. It's just inevitable. So I personally believe that developers would be better off just telling us the truth. Just be honest. Just tell us that the consoles cannot handle it. What do they honestly think is going to happen? It might slightly sour their relationship with Sony and Microsoft, but you know what? It's not like Sony and Microsoft are going to tell you, Ubisoft, you cannot release any more games, screw you. It's not going to happen. Because they know at the end of the day, people are still going to buy the bloody console, because what choice do they have? Yes, they can PC game, but not everyone's technically inclined enough, or they can't afford it, or they're just not interested in it. I have a friend who's quite wealthy. He's more than affluent enough to PC game. He's got the cash. He is technically minded enough to do it. He built his own PC at one point. Yes, he had me help him choose a few components, but he's got the skill to do it himself. He doesn't like to PC game. It is that black and white. He uses it occasionally for certain games, but just generally he doesn't like to play it. I've tried to convert him towards the dark side, it just doesn't work. He plays it for a bit, he plays a couple of games here and there, but generally speaking he prefers console gaming, which is fair enough. A couple of hours ago on Facebook, I made a post that basically said, what pisses me off more, and this is on the redgamingtech.com Facebook, seriously, the frame rate thing doesn't piss me off as much as developers lying. Just be honest, say the consoles can't handle 60 FPS or a set resolution, half the internet complaints would disappear overnight. And you know what? A lot of people just agreed, and I said the same thing on my own personal Facebook. People agreed. That's the thing. The reason this keeps coming up, the reason this keeps getting turned into 30 or 40 page bloody threads on NeoGAF is because of the ludicrousy of the statements. Just be honest, please. It would be easier. Yes, you would get the initial shock from people who don't really understand it. Yes, you might lose a few sales here and there. Yes, you might get a bit of crying. But ultimately, eventually, people are going to know about this stuff. And it's just going to be... You know what? It's going to be better for consumer confidence as well. If you're attributed to being an honest developer, people are going to be more willing to buy your stuff. As much as I'm not best buddies with Electronic Arts, I will say that for the most part, I'm not saying they're perfect, but for the most part, they've kept out of this resolution thing. You know, they've just said, as far as I understand, I might have missed a quote, so if I have, correct me. I honestly, I haven't personally seen Electronic Arts try to say, well, the reason we've selected this, they don't really say anything. They just said, this is the resolution we're running at, or this is the frame rate we're running at. Done. That's it. And that's the best way to be. If you don't want to give any more information, just say, it's the best decision for what we thought was the best decision for the game. Or best decision for the quality and whatever PR marketing crap you want to use, right? I do marketing, but for this purpose I'm just going to quit crap. Just use it. But don't try to tell us lies, because it's going to piss people off. There is nothing that pisses people off more than knowing that you are telling them false information. It's a flagrant disregard to their intelligence, and moreover, you're telling them something which is just blatantly incorrect. And so it just doesn't make sense. So I honestly think this situation is not going to resolve itself, but it would be considerably better if developers were just honest. And I think if honesty was applied to the situation, people would be a lot less upset. And those that aren't technically informed, they're not going to know anything. They're just going to be like, oh, the PS4 can't handle this. Oh, well, whatever. Cool, I'm going to buy the PS4 anyway, or I'm going to buy the Xbox One. Because they're not technically informed enough about it. If you don't know enough about it anyway to know what a frame rate is, all they're going to hear is that the PS4 can't do it. Okay? Whatever. That's it. But when they continuously see, and they will, continuously see their more informed friends, or it continuously pop up on, you know, big websites and NeoGAF and all of these other news sites that, you know, they've said this quote and people are rioting about it, that stuff is going to resonate, and that is going to be, in my opinion, that much more harmful. Anyway, frustrating. Very, very frustrating, to my opinion. Anyway. Yee dear. Anyway, I really just wish companies would just be that much more honest. If they were, I think it would just be better for everyone. Honesty is, in this case, just the best policy. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Apologies for being a bit ranty. I wanted this to be a lot shorter, but you have no idea how difficult it was for me to fight the inner rage. Oh well, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.